Let the light of your glory shine on us. Let the light of your glory shine on us. Let the light of your glory shine on us. Let the light of your glory shine on us. Spirit, come, Spirit of the living one, come move us again, come shine on us. Spirit, come, we surrender to your touch, come move us again, come shine. Spirit, come, Spirit of the living one, come move us again, come shine on us. Spirit, come, we surrender to your touch, come move us again, come shine your light on us. Shine your light on us. Shine your light on us. Shine your light
Have you ever been persecuted, faced oppression from other unbelievers or just people who maybe even just insulted you? I know I had a friend who was a youth pastor back when I was doing student ministry who went to visit a middle school, and as he was going into the lunchroom to meet with students, some kid stood up, threw an orange across the lunchroom and hit him in the head. And that was the persecution he faced. Everybody started laughing at him. And so I don't know about you, but I know in that situation, he was truly ashamed. He did keep going back to the school to share the gospel, because it's what we're called to do, is not to be ashamed when we face difficulty and persecution, insults, oppression, types of injustice. And so today, as we continue in Peter's writing, Peter is writing as a man who had faced persecution. He had had a time in his life when Jesus was arrested where he denied even knowing Jesus. And so he was ashamed of Jesus. He gave in to that. And then later in life, we know that he was a martyr for the cause of Christ and that he gave his life. And even most tradition has that he was crucified upside down. So Peter writes to us about persecution and suffering. He writes as a man who's well acquainted with the ups and downs of that, but also he's well acquainted with years upon years of persecution. And hopefully you will not be a person who faces persecution, but if you do, or if you're facing some sort of suffering, the words that he writes to you and I today are encouraging us as we go through those difficult times. I remember years ago when I would read books like Fox's Books of Martyrs. There's another book I have called Martyrs. I remember in the 90s, DC Talk came out with the Jesus Freak book. It was all about these people who had gone through these really difficult trials as they followed Christ. And the reality of it is sometimes we are called to suffer with Jesus as we follow with Jesus. So his words, Peter's words toward us will be encouraging to us as we dive in and try to understand what it is he says that we should be thinking and doing when we face these kinds of sufferings. He says, this is 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 14, if you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because of the Spirit of glory and of God rest upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet, if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. The very first word in this section is if. It means it's a conditional statement that you and I may or may not face persecution. It says in this particular verse that if we are insulted, and my hope is that you'll never be insulted, but there may come a time where you're insulted because you decided to follow Christ, or you or identify with Christ, and you are allowing Him to use your life to spread the gospel. And so if you are insulted, he says, you are blessed. And now that seems like that doesn't work together. That doesn't fit together, because how could it be if I'm insulted that I'm blessed? But the writer Peter is saying to us, because he's experienced this, that you're getting to be accounted with Jesus. Jesus said, any of you who follow me, you should expect to be persecuted. If I was persecuted, you'll be persecuted. So Jesus was insulted, so we should have some level of expectation that we're going to be rejected and insulted. There's a famous story about John Wesley. There's some debate on whether or not this truly happened, but it's a story where he supposedly was really concerned because he had gone 3 whole days without being persecuted or insulted, or nobody's thrown anything at him, an egg or a rock or anything. And so as he was traveling on his journeys to share the gospel, he decided to get down off his horse because he was concerned about this, thought maybe there was something off in his life, and that's why he wasn't being persecuted. And he began to pray to the Lord that he would, if there be anything in him that would cause people not to identify him with Christ and to treat him that way, that the Lord would show him. And while he was praying, supposedly there was this other man who was walking by who knew that he was a Methodist preacher. So he picked up a brick and he threw it at John Wesley while he was praying. And so the story goes that John Wesley jumped up on his feet and he praised God that he had gotten persecuted. And it reminded me of this passage, as if you're insulted, that you should count it as being blessed. And so I do know, I don't know for sure that John Wesley went through that story, but it's a pretty famous story about his life. If you know anything about the history of John Wesley, it does seem in line with John Wesley. But also we see this all throughout the text of the New Testament, particularly in the writings of Paul and the writings of Peter, who both were examples of being blessed because they were persecuted. Paul talks about rejoicing in the fellowship of the sufferings of Christ. Peter writes these words about being insulted and being blessed. And so both Peter and Paul were persecuted in incredibly difficult ways, and being placed in prison, being scourged, being ostracized. And so they know what it's like to be accounted with Jesus in his sufferings. And one of the things that's interesting is, as Peter writes, he says, I want you to think that you're blessed if you are persecuted. But he also says, now, if you're suffering because you've been doing wrong, that's not a commendable thing. That's something that you should be ashamed of. But if you're suffering for the cause of Christ, you should take joy in that. You should be happy about that. And so he says, like, look, if you're suffering because he names, if you're a murderer, a thief, or evildoer, or even a meddler, someone who's using your words to harm people. He says, for example, if you are a person who got arrested for murder and you go to jail and you're suffering because you're in prison and you don't want to be there and it's just a horrible time for you, and you're enduring it, he says, you don't get any credit for that. That's not commendable. You're getting a just punishment for something that you did. Now, but if you're suffering for doing good, now that's a different story. And so one of the indicators, I believe, of a follower of Christ is that they will endure suffering. They will, stay the course when things are really hard. I mean, if I were to ask you, what is what makes a person, how do you know that they're really a follower of Christ? How do you know that they are really in line with Christ, they're a believer? What are the indicators? I think many of us would say, well, they profess to follow Jesus, and maybe they attend a worship in church on a regular basis, or maybe it's they have the knowledge. In other words, they can articulate some theology and they can memorize scripture. Maybe it's you know that they're a member of your church, or simply, you saw them get baptized. And so those are all things that could be indicators that they are followers of Christ. But I think one that kind of rises even beyond that, obviously, baptism is the core of it is that I'm identifying with as a follower of Christ. But what suffering does is it really identifies those who are followers of Christ, because it's easy to say I follow Christ when things are good and it's culturally acceptable to say, hey, I love Jesus when everybody else loves Jesus. But when everybody else hates Jesus, are you willing to say, I'm standing with Jesus, and you don't get into that moment of weakness like Peter did. And Peter said, I don't know who y'all are talking about. And so, are you able to stay the course when the stakes are high, when the stakes are painful? And suffering for Christ is a strong indicator that you are a true follower of Christ. And so the 12 apostles, they all were willing to give their life for what they had seen and heard. So when they began to get persecuted by the religious leaders at the temple, and they said, hey, we killed Jesus, and we have the power to take your life too. Their response was, we can't stop talking about what we've seen and heard. In other words, you can threaten us all you want. You can insult us all you want. You can do these things to us, but we're not going to stop telling people about Jesus. They were willing to face suffering for what they had seen and heard, what they had seen. They had seen Jesus do all these miracles, but even on top of that, they'd seen Jesus crucified, buried, and resurrected, and it changed everything. So the guys who had all deserted Jesus, the guys who had all denied Jesus, all of a sudden became men who were willing to give their life and suffer greatly for the cause of Christ. And then Paul, who was even a persecutor of those people, when he met Jesus on the road to Damascus, everything changed for him, and the person who was willing to kill those who were followers of Christ became the person who was willing to die for the cause of Christ. And so when we go through suffering, it's often a really strong indicator of where we are in terms of our relationship with Jesus. And so, we all want to be pursuing that and not be ashamed. When Paul writes in Romans chapter 1, he says, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, for it's the power of salvation for those who believe. And so in the same way, we want to take that same stance. And so Peter writes this, and he said, look, it's time for judgment to begin in the household of God. In other words, the church is going to go through this difficulty, and that difficulty is going to have a weeding out effect. In other words, it's going to be a separation from the wheat and chaff. It's going to be a separation of sheep and goats. In the final judgment, you'll have that separation. But he even says, but the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel, in other words, they are not righteous by faith in Jesus Christ, those who don't trust in Jesus Christ, the outcome's going to be worse. In other words, he says, if the righteous are scarcely saved, we as believers in Jesus, we're saved, but we just barely get in, because we don't get in because we do good and we are righteous by our own works. We get in because really by the skin of our teeth, so to speak. Most of us, when we walk into heaven, will probably have the smell of smoke on us. And so, but the person who is an unbeliever, his question is, what's going to happen to them? So, it's a tough judgment for us as believers, but it's a terrible judgment for those who are not. And so, as Peter rounds out this chapter, he says these words, therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. There's several things I think are really important for us to remember as we close today. One, he says, look, so if you're suffering, now I would, open up that suffering category to not just being persecuted, but if you're going through suffering, he says, according to God's will, And he says, entrust your souls to the Creator while doing good. Because if you're suffering, you have a tendency to not want to keep doing good. And so keep doing good. And in the process, remember that it's according to God's will, and to entrust your very soul to the Father, to the Creator. Now, I think a great example of that is when we look at Jesus in two places, in the Garden of Gethsemane, before he went to the cross, and when we look at Jesus on the cross, because Jesus was going through intense suffering in both of those scenes in the Gospels. And when you read the Gospel the Gospel presentation of that, you see the suffering, and he continues to do good. How? Because he gives his life for sinners. In the process of that, what he does is, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's sweating drops of blood. I mean, we can't even imagine what it would look like to be facing an execution on a cross, and you're going to bear the sins of the world in your body. And so he's there, and he's sweating drops of blood. And what does he say? He's praying to God, if there be any other way, let this cup pass from me. But then he says, according to God's will, like Peter says, he says, not my will be done, but yours. In other words, I'm going to accept your will for my life, even if it means suffering. And then we look at him on the cross, and he's hanging on the cross, and he's bleeding, and his blood he's almost, out of blood. He can't get air because you die in the crucifixion by asphyxiation. And he's hanging there on the cross. And Peter writes, entrust yourself to the Father. And then so he says, hey, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And so in that moment, he models for us what it would look like if we go through persecution and we face suffering, how we should look at that. We should keep doing good. We should trust that this is the will of the Father for our life, and we entrust our very souls, our very being to God. And so our conversation with God and to ourselves should be, Lord, whatever I'm going through, it's not my will, but your will be done. And I'm going to entrust you with my life. I believe that you're wise, you're powerful, and you're good. Even though this circumstance is terrible for me, I'm going to keep trusting you that even in the worst things, Jesus crucified, the only man to ever live a perfect life on earth, innocent, everybody else is guilty. That man entrusted his life so much that the worst thing that could happen, all the sins of the world were placed on him. He was willing to take that on, and that terrible event became the best event ever because it led to the resurrection and it led to hope. So while he was suffering, he continued doing good. He entrusted himself to the Creator, and he embraced that it was God's will for his life. And that's the encouragement we have today. So whatever you're going through, whatever suffering you're facing, take the same attitude of Christ, as Paul writes in Philippians chapter 2. Have the same mindset as Christ, and know that God is going to take all these things that were meant for evil, and he will bring about good.
Shine